Welcome back to the machine learning lecture. This week we're learning about clustering. Usually when people think about unsupervised learning, one of the first examples they have in mind is clustering. And the idea is pretty simple. We want to group together similar instances or similar objects. Clustering is an unsupervised learning problem, which means that we're given access to an unlabeled dataset and we're trying to uncover the latent or hidden structure within the data. In clustering, the latent structure is exactly finding these groups of instances which are somehow similar to each other. In the previous weeks, we discussed dimensionality reduction, and this was a different kind of unsupervised learning. In dimensionality reduction, we were given a dataset with instances which have high dimensional feature vectors, and we wanted to find a low dimensional representation for each instance such that the overall structure of the data is well preserved. In clustering, we simply want to group similar instances together. Let's look at one example to clarify how these two differ. Let's say we have a 2D dataset, and each of these points is one instance. Now, if we're doing dimensionality reduction here, we would like to project the data from 2D to 1D. And let's say we're running the principal component analysis, which means that we find the direction which has most variance, and this is this line, and then we simply project the data onto this line to find the 1D representation. In clustering, the only thing we want to do is just group together instances which are similar. So in this case, those would be these instances, because they are similar to each other, so they form one group, one cluster. These instances form another group, and these instances form another group. So in clustering, what holds simultaneously is that the instances within the same cluster are similar to each other, and if two instances are in two different clusters, then they are dissimilar from each other. Another way to think about dimensionality reduction versus clustering is that in dimensionality reduction, we're finding a continuous representation for each instance. So each instance is represented with a low dimensional vector, which are k real numbers. While in clustering, what we're doing is representing each instance with a single discrete number. This means this number tells us basically to which cluster does this instance belong to. So the first instance belongs to the fifth cluster, the second instance belongs to the third cluster, the third instance belongs to the fourth cluster, and so on. But nonetheless, the main point of clustering is that we want to group similar instances together in the same group in the same cluster. Clustering has many different applications across different domains. One of the most practically relevant applications is in bioinformatics to study biomedical data. Here, a good example is gene expression analysis. What happens is that we have different samples. Maybe these are samples from the same tissue for different individuals, or samples from different tissues for the same individual. And what we're doing is we're measuring the amount of gene, how much a certain gene is expressed in each of these samples. And this is a lab experiment that some technicians are carrying out. And when people run such analyses, they typically measure thousands or tens of thousands of genes and thousands or tens of thousands of samples. So you can imagine that this data set is pretty difficult to interpret or understand if you're just directly looking at it. So instead, people run a clustering algorithm in order to get some insights from this data. And the way this data looks like is something like this, where each row corresponds to one sample, each column corresponds to one gene, and each entry in this matrix tells us how much a certain gene is expressed into a certain sample. And this is here visualized with red, white, and blue, which means low, medium, or high expression. So one thing you can do here is you can cluster the genes themselves. So now you can treat each column as one instance and then cluster these instances, which means clustering the sets of genes. And some interesting insights could be here that if a certain set of genes has similar expression across many different samples, they'll be put in the same cluster, and maybe these genes are evolved together or they are reinforcing each other somehow to produce the biological effect that you're studying in your samples. Or what you can also do here is cluster the samples themselves. So now each row is one instance, and then you're clustering the rows, or basically clustering the samples. And this can also tell you some interesting insights. If these are corresponding to healthy and individuals which have some disease, then by clustering these genes, you can potentially learn which genes are more expressed in the healthy individuals and which genes are more expressed into the individuals with the disease, and so on. But whatever the case may be, running clustering on such data is very valuable. But of course, you have to have the domain knowledge in order to interpret the final clusters that you get. So in this case, the domain knowledge from biology. So that was one example. A different example is running clustering to do user profiling. So you can imagine maybe that you have a data set with users, and these might be demographics data for each user, or there might be some data about how these users are using your system. But whatever this data might be, you might want to run clustering to group similar users into the same cluster. And this might look something like this. So these are your users, and then in this case, we've grouped our users in 3 different clusters, and similar users end up in the same cluster. Now, depending on what your system is doing, you might treat these clusters differently, and then maybe if you're running some marketing campaign, you can send different marketing materials to these different users. We also talked about in one of the previous videos about recommendation systems, and we mentioned there the cold start problem, which was that you have a new user coming in and you can't do any good recommendations because you don't have any history of how this user is rating the data. So what you can do is you can run clustering based on demographics data and then do recommendation based on the other users which end up in the same cluster as this new user that is now coming into your system. You can also do clustering on images. So you can imagine that you're given a single image, and then now you treat each pixel into that image as one instance. And what you want to do is you want to group similar pixels together. And what this is going to end up looking like is that you're going to get image segmentation. So let's say that we have this original image here, and then we run clustering, and let's say we want to find 2 clusters. So basically what we're saying is take all of the pixels in the image and split them into 2 clusters, such that the pixels in the first cluster are similar to each other and the pixels in the second cluster are also similar to each other. And here, in this example, you see that the first cluster shown with blue picks up the background, while the second cluster shown in orange picks up the foreground, or this person in this case. And then, of course, you can run with 3, 4, or 5 clusters and so on, and these will typically pick up different objects because objects tend to have the same kind of pixels because they have the same kind of color. Of course, today you have much more advanced algorithms for image segmentation based on deep learning and so on, but still clustering can be useful if you want to do image segmentation. You can also do clustering on a data set of different images. So now instead of having a single image and clustering the pixels, you can have many images and cluster the images themselves. And this can be useful to organize your album, for example, your photo album. So you can have images of forests grouped into the forest cluster, images of dogs grouped into the dog cluster, and so on. You can do compression with clustering, right? So that's what we mentioned in the previous slide, that basically we're representing each instance with a single number, which tells us that this instance goes into cluster number 5 and so on. So if you want to do a very aggressive data compression, you can basically first run a clustering algorithm and then forget all the data and only remember the cluster indicators. And for some applications, this is already enough because it captures the main structure in the data, and you don't really need to remember all the individual features for each instance. You can also run clustering on the users of a social network. For example, you can cluster users on Twitter based on who they're following and who they followed by. And in this case, because we're running clustering on social network data, this is called community detection, but it's really just plain old clustering. And we'll learn about community detection in the follow-up lecture, Machine Learning on Graphs and Sequences. You can also use clustering to better visualize your data and so on. It really has many different applications. Formally, what we're trying to do is, given a data set of an unlabeled data set or a collection of data points, we're trying to assign each of the data points to a single cluster. And we want to do this assignment such that the data points that end up in the same cluster are similar to each other. And if two data points end up in a different cluster, then they are dissimilar from each other. And in the rest of the videos this week, we'll look at two different approaches to this. One is called the k-means approach, and the other one is an approach based on Gaussian mixture models. This type of clustering is called non-overlapping clustering, which means that each instance gets assigned only to a single cluster. But there's also some other extensions called overlapping clustering, which we're not going to learn about. But the idea in overlapping clustering, just so you have the information, is basically that a single instance may belong to multiple different clusters. For example, you might have a cluster of people who enjoy running, a cluster of people who enjoy reading, a cluster of people who enjoy playing computer games, and then it might not be ideal that you assign your user only to one of these clusters. Maybe a user enjoys two or more of these activities and you want to assign them to two or more clusters. And the ideas are similar to the overlapping, to the non-overlapping case that we'll discuss, but we don't have enough time to discuss all possible extensions of clustering. Okay, and then now we first start with discussing the k-means approach, which is one of the easiest and most widely known algorithms or models for clustering data. The k-means algorithm is based on distances, which means that as long as you can specify a distance function between your data points, you'll be able to run k-means on any different kinds of data. And you'll notice here that we've kept the definitions rather general, which means we have two inputs from some input space x, and then we have a similarity function which outputs a single number, which tells us how similar or dissimilar these two inputs are. And of course, working with similarity functions or with distance functions is equivalent. So high similarity is equivalent to low distance and the other way around. So this input space x could be, for example, the set of all d-dimensional vectors. So it could be Rd, but it could also be the set of all strings or the set of all graphs or any other crazy data objects that you can come up with. As long as you can specify a similarity or a distance function between two objects, you can run k-means and other algorithms based on distances like it. So for the rest of the video, we're actually going to work with distances because they're slightly easier. And what this means now is that all of the instances that end up in the same cluster will have low distance between each other, or that's what we want. And all of the instances that end up in different clusters, we want them to have high distance from each other. Okay. We're also going to focus in the video on Euclidean data, on d-dimensional vector data, but know that basically all of these concepts apply to other kinds of data like strings or graphs and so on. And in Euclidean data, for vectors, basically there are a couple of established ways to measure distance between vectors. And these are the Manhattan distance, the Euclidean distance, Mahalanobis distance, and so on. So there's also more examples. And here I just want to briefly visualize the difference between these types of distances. So let's say we have two data points, A and B. Now, if we're measuring the Euclidean distance between these two vectors, this is just the L2 norm between A and B. So the difference, if we plug in the A vector and the B vector and compute the L2 norm of the difference, we get the Euclidean distance, which is just the shortest path between these, the direct shortest path between A and B. However, if we're working with the Manhattan distance, this is now the L1 norm of the difference vector, and the shortest path in L1 norm looks something like this. So this would be the shortest path. So this is L1. Also equivalently, you can go something like that. So this is why it's called Manhattan distance, because regardless of whether you take this path or any other path where you first walk in one direction, then in the other direction, then in the other direction, and so on, all of these have the same L1 distance. While for the L2 distance, only the shortest path is the path that has the shortest distance. So this is L2 distance here. And then we have Also the Mahalanobis distance, which is a kind of generalization of the Euclidean distance. So basically you have this matrix sigma, which gives different features, different weights. So this is a matrix which tells you that if I and j, so if the two input vectors differ in the feature number 5, maybe this is not as important as if they differ in feature number 3 and so on. And maybe, so the way you specify this matrix is on some prior knowledge, or maybe you can even learn this matrix directly from the data. So one thing here that holds is that if you plug in sigma inverse as the identity matrix, so it disappears basically, you're gonna get back the Euclidean distance. The details about these distances are not too critical for understanding how k-means works. As long as you have a distance function which tells you how similar or dissimilar inputs from your input space are, you can apply k-means to your data. That's why in the next set of slides we're going to focus on the standard RD space and the Euclidean distance metric, but basically all of the discussion applies to other distances and other spaces. Okay, so in k-means, basically we have two sets of parameters that we optimize over. We have the cluster indicators and the cluster centroids. The cluster indicators tell us which instance belongs to which cluster, and these are one-hot vectors. So for example, the cluster indicator for the data point I, zi, will be a k-dimensional one-hot vector, and it is k-dimensional because we want to cluster the data into k different clusters. Because it's a one-hot vector, this means that it has zeros everywhere except at a particular point, which indicates to which cluster does this data point belong to. So in this case, the data point I has zeros everywhere except at the third position, which means that data point I belongs to cluster 3. And we have these cluster indicators for each of our data instances. Now, as I said, in addition to the cluster indicators, we also have the cluster centroids. And these are d-dimensional vectors, which means they're of the same size as the input space. And basically we have one centroid for each of the clusters, and then the way you should think about this is that they summarize that cluster. Basically they are the center of that cluster, and that's why they're called the centroids. Now, what we're doing in k-means is we're trying to optimize or find the best possible cluster indicators and the best possible centroids that minimize a certain objective function. In order to better understand how these objective functions look like, we're going to look at a particular example. Now, for the moment, imagine that we have some 2D data set, and imagine that we somehow have randomly initialized the different cluster indicators and the different centroids. So let's say we've initialized these data points to belong to the red cluster. We've also initialized these data points to belong to the blue cluster. And we've initialized these data points to belong to the green cluster. Somehow randomly, for example. Now, in addition, we have, as I said, the cluster indicators, the cluster centroids, and let's mark them with an X. So this is the centroid for the blue cluster, this is the centroid for the green cluster, and this is the centroid for the red cluster. So what the objective function does is basically it takes all of the points in the red cluster and it computes the distance to the red centroid, all of the points in the blue cluster, the distance to the blue centroid, and so on. So basically, from all of these points, we compute the distance to the red cluster. From all of the green points, we compute the distance to the green cluster, and all of the blue points, the distance to the blue cluster. And what we want is that these distances are as small as possible. Basically, we want to find such centroids and such cluster indicators such that when you compute the distances from each instance to its own centroid, to have the distances be as small as possible. So we can also look at this a different way if we take this objective function and we open it up. So we write down this sum over k to see what's going on. So let's do this. So this is now sum over all data points I. And let's say that in this example, we have only 3 clusters. So the way this is going to look like, we have Zi1, and then the distance from xi to the first centroid, mu1, plus Zi2, and the distance from the data point to the second cluster, or the centroid of the second cluster, and plus Zi3 times the distance of the data point to the third centroid, mu3. And remember now, because the Zi vector is a one-hot vector, only one of these 3 terms will kick in, right? Because let's say the data point I belongs to the second cluster, that means that Zi1 and Zi3 will be 0, and only Zi2 will be 1, which means that we'll only measure the distance from the data point to the second centroid. And this goes on then for all of the data points I. So basically what we're doing in k-means is we're looking for the best possible centroids and the best possible cluster indicators, such that the distance from each of the data points to the centroid of the cluster they are assigned to is as small as possible. And yeah, we can write down this objective function in this form. Now, turns out that solving this optimization problem is really difficult. For one, we have a discrete variable, right? So Zi is a one-hot vector. It's not something continuous, so you cannot really easily run a gradient descent approach or something like that. And actually, you can prove that the k-means objective is NP-hard, so it's really difficult to solve. And it's NP-hard even in some special cases, like if you only have 2 clusters, or if you only have planar data, and so on. So it turns out this problem is actually pretty difficult to solve. And even if we make some sort of relaxation where we say, wait a minute, we're not going to look at discrete data, but we're going to relax these cluster indicators to be between 0 and 1. Even in that case, the objective is still non-convex, which means, again, it's pretty difficult to solve. So solving this problem directly finding the cluster indicators and the centroids cannot easily be done in closed form. However, if we look at the 2 separate problems where we say, now imagine that the centroids are fixed and we're only looking for the cluster indicators, this can be solved very easily. Or the other way around, you say, imagine that the cluster indicators are fixed. What are the best centroids? This can also be solved easily. So this maybe reminds you already of the alternating optimization that we talked about in the previous videos, and it's very similar. So solving the problem with both variables at once, it's difficult, but if you fix one variable and solve for the other, and the other way around, it's actually pretty easy to solve. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to do an alternating optimization where we update Z given a fixed mu and update mu given a fixed Z until we converge. And this algorithm is called the Lloyd's algorithm for solving k-means. Lloyd's algorithm turns out to be pretty simple, and we show the entire pseudocode on this one slide. We start by initializing the centroids. We'll see exactly how we do this in the next slides, but for the moment imagine that we have somehow initialized the centroids. Let's work through one example to see exactly how it works. So we start by initializing, let's say we have 3 clusters, so we initialize 3 centroids. Maybe this is the first cluster, so this is mu1. This is the second cluster over here, let's say mu2, and this is the third cluster, mu3. Now, keeping the clusters fixed, we want to find the best possible assignment, the best possible cluster indicator for each of our data points. And let's say we just have one data point, and this is this data point over here. So what would be the best possible cluster indicator for this data point if you already know the centroids? Well, the simplest thing you can do is just compute the distances to all of these centroids and choose the smallest one. In this case, this would be the smallest one, right? Because if we go back to the objective function, so the objective function looks at the distance from the cluster to which the data point is assigned to that particular centroid. And in order to minimize the distance, basically for that data point, you just pick which centroid is the closest. And you do this for all of the data points. So for all of the data points, you calculate the distance to the centroid and you pick the smallest one. And that's already the solution of the first sub-problem. And this is how we write this down. Basically, the cluster indicator for data point I is exactly 1, where this is the centroid, which is the closest to that data point. Okay, that's pretty simple. So if you know the cluster centroids, compute the distances for every data point to every centroid and pick the smallest distance. Now, let's say we've done this step. Now we have to do the second step, where given the cluster indicators, we have to update the centroids. So the way this would look like, let's say we have some data points which we've computed and their cluster indicators which we've computed in the previous step. So let's say these data points are assigned to the green, these data points are assigned to the red, these to the green, and these to the blue cluster. Now, what is the best possible way to now update the centroids that minimizes the distance? Again, this is our objective function. We're just minimizing the distance from the data point to the centroid. Well, the best possible way is to just compute the mean for all of the data points that are assigned to a particular cluster. You take the blue data points, compute their mean, and say this is the new centroid. And this is over here, for example. For the red data points, you do the same, compute their mean, and say that the new centroid is exactly the mean. And same for the green, the new centroid is the mean. And basically this is it. That's already k-means. You iterate these two steps until you converge. You start with some centroids, then for each data point compute the distance to the centroid and choose the smallest one. This is the updating the cluster indicators part. Then once you know the cluster indicators, you just update the centroids such that they are the mean of their own cluster. And each of these steps locally minimizes the objective function. But now if we do them alternatively, at some point we're going to converge. Okay, that's pretty simple. And we can also visualize how this looks like. So here we have some data, which at the beginning we don't know to which cluster this data belongs to. And we've initialized two clusters here shown with x's as well. And then the first thing we do is we compute the distance from every data point to these two centroids. So all of these are closer to this centroid, so they are assigned to that centroid, and all of these data points are closer to this centroid, so they are assigned to that new centroid. And then we recompute now the mean of the red ones, the mean of the blue ones, and we get two new centroids, two new means, which are this one and this one. And then we repeat this until we converge. We see that pretty quickly, already after the first iteration of the algorithm, the two clusters start to separate out quite nicely. Here we see an interactive visualization which can help you better understand what is going on and what happens in each step of the algorithm. As before, we start by initializing randomly the three centroids, the orange, green, and blue centroid shown with the triangles over here. And the first step, as we said, was to assign each data point to the closest centroid. So let's do that. And we see that all of these data points in the top get assigned to the blue centroid. All of the data points over here get assigned to the green centroid. And all of the data points over here get assigned to the orange centroid. Now, the second step of the algorithm was to then update the centroids by computing the mean of the blue and updating the mean of the green and updating, and the mean of the orange and updating. So let's do that, and we see now the centroids have moved exactly to the new mean. Now we just repeat. We find the closest centroid, update the mean. Closest centroid, update the mean, and so on. So we see that at some point nothing changes anymore, and that means we have converged. So in this case, we were actually a bit unlucky because we started with a weird initialization. We now ended up in a solution where this is the first cluster down here. These two are in one cluster because they're now closest to blue, and all of these data points to the left, top left, our orange cluster. Let's see what happens if we have a different initialization. Let's say something like this. Again, we run the algorithm, and we see that here we were a bit more lucky. Now, we correctly identified that this is the first cluster, this is the second cluster, and this is the third cluster. And we also see that the error is smaller than before. So in general, k-means can be very sensitive to the initialization. If you start out with clusters or centroids which are very close to each other or somehow not initialized in a nice way, you might end up missing the correct clusters. And this is because essentially the alternating optimization procedure is not guaranteed to find always the global optimal solution. But what you can do is you can restart the algorithm with multiple times and then choose the one which gives you the lowest error. Also, that you can just choose a smarter initialization, and we're going to see in the next slides how to what is the best or one of the best initializations we can use. If you explore the interactive demo on the following link, you'll quite quickly realize that the quality of the solution highly depends on the initialization of the centroids. And somehow we want to find an initialization which is more likely to give us good results. And another thing you might notice is that if we start out with centroids which are very close to each other, we tend to get a bad solution, while if the centroids are spread out, we get a better solution. And this is exactly what we're trying to do. We're going to initialize the centroids such that they cover all of our data and they are nicely spread out. So all of the centroids should be as far as possible from each other, and they should cover the entire data set. And this is called the k-means ++ algorithm, and actually has some provable guarantees on top of it. But we're not going to get into the theoretical details. We're only going to discuss how this algorithm works. Okay, so let's see how it works. We start with some data set as always, and let's say the data set looks something like this. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to randomly choose one of the data points as our first centroid. Let's say we randomly choose this one, and this will be our first centroid. The reason why we're doing this is if we just randomly initialize the first centroid, we might get something way over here, far away from all of the data points, and this doesn't make sense. It makes much more sense to start with one of the data points because this will give us potentially a good coverage already. Okay, so we start with our first centroid, which is randomly, uniformly at random chosen from one of the data points. Then what we do is we compute the distance from all of the other data points to this first centroid. So the distance from all of the other data points to the first centroid. And or the distance squared, which is this di squared. And now what we're going to do is we're going to sample which of these data points we're going to choose as the second centroid in proportion to the distance. So the further the data point is from the first centroid, the more likely it is to get chosen as the second centroid. So of all of the distances, of all the data points, we give higher weight to those that are further apart. And let's say if we do this sampling step, now the second centroid will be somewhere over here. So here you might wonder, why don't we just simply choose as the second centroid the data point which is furthest away from the first centroid? And yes, this is potentially reasonable, but turns out if you do this probabilistic sampling, you get slightly better theoretical guarantees. But as I said, I'm not going to go into details for this. Okay, and then what do you do for the next set of centroids? Well, now again, for each of the data points, now you compute the distance to both of the centroids. You choose the smaller one of the two, and then again, you use this to sample in proportion to the smaller one of the distances. And you repeat this until you find all of your k-centroids. And what this is going to end up doing is that basically you're going to get centroids we have spread out all over your data set. So just one time for clarity, the deterministic version of this would be that you pick one data point as the center, as the centroid, then you choose the one which is furthest apart as the second centroid, then you choose the next one which is as far as possible from both of these as the next centroid, and so on. But we do this instead of in a deterministic fashion, we do it in a probabilistic fashion because this ends up giving us better guarantees. Okay, and then this is the initialization called k-means++, and now we basically have all of the ingredients to obtain a good k-means algorithm. An advantage of k-means is that it is conceptually simple and you can implement it with a few lines of Python code. If you use Lloyd's algorithm, it is also computationally inexpensive, because both update steps, updating the cluster indicators and updating the centroids, are pretty cheap to do. You roughly need O of n times k, where n is the number of samples and k is the number of clusters, operations to do both update steps. In addition, the number of iterations you need to converge between the two update steps tends to be quite low in practice, which gives you an overall pretty fast runtime. However, the quality of k-means highly depends on the distance functions that you choose. Let's say you're working with image data, then if you compute distances between images directly in pixel space, this will not give you good results, because whether two images are similar or not, it doesn't really depend on how far away they are from each other in pixel space. You can imagine maybe that the two images have the same object, but one is slightly translated to the right, then the pixel distance will be quite large, even though they're essentially the same image. But if you run some sort of dimensionality reduction algorithm, maybe, which projects the data into low dimensional space and finds the latent structure, and then you do k-means in the low dimensional space, this might give you better results. Maybe you run TSNE on the data set, and then you do k-means on the TSNE output of the data. And this often gives you better results, as I said. In addition, similar to other algorithms which use distances, like the k-nearest neighbor algorithm, k-means can suffer from the curse of dimensionality. So often you might need to pre-process the data in some way to maybe project it to a low dimensional space. In addition to these issues, there are other issues with k-means which can't be so easily solved. For example, one of the big ones is that it cannot really detect clusters which have convex hulls which are overlapping. So let me show you one example to illustrate what I mean. So let's say we have some data and it looks something like this. So this is the so-called two moons data set, because the data looks like it has two moons which are overlapping with each other. And ideally, what we would want is to find exactly these data points as the first cluster and these other data points as the second cluster. However, depending on the distance functions you choose, you will almost never be able to find these clusters with k-means, because if you look at the convex hulls, so the convex hull of the first cluster is this one, and the convex hull of the second cluster is this one, you'll see that they are highly overlapping. And why k-means doesn't work in this case is related to the underlying assumptions which are not explicit. Let me tell you a bit more what I mean with this. So let's say you have two centroids, this centroid and this centroid. And you can imagine, now that we're using the Euclidean distance, and you can imagine this balls of equal radius around each of the data points, each of the centroids. So what's going to happen in k-means is that all of the data points that are closer to this cluster will get assigned to the red, and all of the data points which are closer to this cluster will get assigned to the blue cluster. And because we're working with Euclidean distance, as you increase the ball around the centroid, the distance grows larger. So basically you have some sort of threshold here where everything around here is assigned to this cluster and everything down here is assigned to the other cluster. And because we're working with Euclidean distance, you get these clusters which have a shape like a sphere, so they're spherical. And if you use Euclidean distance, you will never be able to find shapes which are not spherical, like these two moons data sets. It has other issues where it's sensitive to outliers. So if I have a couple of outliers over here, they might get assigned to their own cluster. You also have no uncertainty measure, which means you don't know whether you're sure or not sure whether this data point belongs to that cluster, because we have a hard assignment. So the cluster indicator is always 0 or 1. Yes, I'm in that cluster, or no, I'm not in that cluster. You don't really have any way to say, oh, maybe I'm sure or not sure whether I'm in this cluster. As we talked before, right, we have the issue with initialization, which comes from the Lloyd's algorithm, but we propose something which can give us some good solution, but it's not guaranteed to always work. So in order to tackle at least some of these issues, we're going to switch to a more probabilistic framework, and we're going to discuss a different model, which is called the Gaussian mixture model. We'll discuss this in the next video. Thank you for your attention now, and looking forward to talking to you about Gaussian mixture models.